Shalom and welcome to Temple Talk. This is Yitzchak Ruvain speaking to you from just east of Jerusalem here in the land of Israel. Today is the 23rd day of the month of Shvat, 5782. It's January 25th, 2022. This coming Shabbat is Shabbat Mevarchin, meaning it is the Shabbat that immediately precedes the upcoming month of Adar, in which we make a blessing and anticipation of the new month. And the new month of Adar, Rosh Chodesh Adar, is a 2-day Rosh Chodesh celebration. It begins Monday evening through Tuesday, and the second day begins Tuesday evening through Wednesday of next week. And this year, we have 2 months of Adar. We have an extra month of Adar. We have that 13th month, which comes around every few years in order to keep the holiday of Passover, Pesach, in the spring season, because we're told that it happened in Aviv. Aviv is spring, and technically that is following the spring vernal equinox. When the vernal equinox is when the day and the night are both 12 hours equal, and following that is the beginning of spring. So every once in a while, since the Hebrew calendar is basically a lunar calendar with adjustments to the solar calendar, we start to we start to create a distance between the scheduling that's proper for Passover, for Pesach in the spring. So we have to add an extra month of Adar. In past times, in the times of the Sanhedrin, times of the Holy Temple, there are other reasons also when they might have added a second month of Adar. And we'll be talking about that not now, but some weeks from now, when it becomes very relevant to what we are studying in the Parsha, in the Torah, in the weekly reading. Speaking of which, this weekly reading, this Shabbat, is Parashat Mishpatim, beginning Exodus chapter 21, verse 1, concluding chapter 24, verse 18. And I'd like to take a moment also to welcome our Spotify listeners. Yes, Temple Talk and also the Parsha teaching by Rav Gedalia Meyer is also now on Spotify. And we are getting listeners on Spotify, so I'd like to welcome you. And for anybody who has just come to us from Spotify, we are the Temple Institute. Our website is Temple Institute, one word, templeinstitute.org. We have a Facebook page. We have a Twitter feed. We have, what's it called? We have Instagram. And we have podcasts. Podcasts also available through Facebook. If you live in America, I believe that the Facebook podcast service is fairly new, and I think they introduced it in America. And I hear that they're starting to introduce it in other countries as well. But if you're not in America, you might not be able to see it on your Facebook app. But if you go to your Spotify app, you can look for Temple Talk or Weekly Torah Study with Rav Gedalia Meyer and find us on Spotify. Okay, let's talk about this week's Parsha Mishpatim, which translates as ordinances. Ordinances, meaning basically civil laws. We're going to be reading a lot of laws that deal with theft, with trespassing, with injury, with accidental injury, with negligent injury, with people who injure intentionally or get into a fight, or God forbid there's murder or manslaughter, as well as all sorts of property laws and anything that would fall under the rubric of laws governing the behavior of man to man. So mishpatim, as opposed to chukim, mishpatim are civil laws, really, and chukim are laws that tend to deal with ritual aspects, with the religion, with our relationship with HaShem. Because a chok is known for not having a basis in a rational explanation. For example, kashrut. Why do we eat certain foods and not eat other foods? Ultimately, it's because God said so, and that's a chok. ultimately, even though there's many arguments, health arguments and other arguments that can say why we separate the food, and meat from milk, and why certain animals we don't eat and certain fish we don't eat, etc., etc. But ultimately, it's because the Torah says so, God said so, so we don't. When it comes to why you shouldn't steal from your neighbor, that also is something that God told us not to do. But I think we can credit ourselves with having the common sense and the rational ability to understand why that's not a good thing. And so that's a mishpat. That's a civil law. So beginning of the parsha goes like this, and I'm reading from chapter 21, verse 1 in the book of Exodus, first in Hebrew, then in English. Ve'ele hamishpatim asher tasim lifnehem. Okay, that's the first verse, and I'm going to stop there. We're going to continue later, but the first verse, and these are the ordinances that you shall place before them. So our sages have asked a question, a very good question. Why does it start with and? And these are the mishpatim, and these are the ordinances. And they say that's to emphasize the fact that this is a continuation of Mount Sinai. This is a continuation of that same unbelievable experience that we read about last week at Mount Sinai, the lightning, the thunder, the quaking of the earth, etc., and the giving of the 10 Commandments. And these are the continuation, meaning you might think that, okay, so that was the 10 Commandments. Now we're getting into, some legal stuff. It's sort of it's not in the same level. It's not the 10 Commandments. It's not so important. Actually, no. Ve'ele, and these are, comes to tell us that these laws are part and parcel of the 10 Commandments. They are every bit as important because they teach us how we can properly live our lives together, right? At peace with one another, and not, with our hands around one another's necks. How we can live at peace and have a peaceful society. So then we might ask the question, okay, like of those 10 commandments, the last number of commandments did have to do with proper behavior between human beings. So yes, it makes sense that this is a continuation, but if you recall, after the 10 commandments, there was our 11th commandment. And with that 11th commandment, we concluded the reading of Yitro from last week's Parashat Jethro. And those concluding verses dealt with building a mizbeach, building an altar, and making offerings for HaShem. Right? You recall that, where HaShem said to Moshe, I'm going to read it right now, chapter 20, verse 19. HaShem said to Moshe, so shall you say to the children of Israel, you have seen that I have spoken to you from heaven. You have made images. You shall not make images of what is with me. My gods of silver and gods of gold shall you not make for yourselves. An altar of earth shall you make for me. And you shall slaughter near it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your flock and your herd. Wherever I permit my name to be mentioned, I shall come to you and bless you. And when you make it for me an altar of stones, do not build them of hewn stones, for you shall have raised your sword over it and desecrated it. But the sword is a weapon of violence, and there's no violence to be associated with the altar. Now, I don't think literally it was understood that people were going to use swords to hew stones, but metal, and metal is associated frequently in the Torah with weapons. In fact, the first Tubal Cain from the second or third or the generation of Noach, I think the generation before Noach would be the 9th generation of man. He was the first who learned how to make metals, and those metals, among other things, were made immediately put into use as weapons. So there's an association always between metal and weapons. So you cannot cut the stones with a metal blade. And he goes on to say it, you shall not ascend my altar on steps, so that your nakedness will not be uncovered upon it. I want to point out one thing, where he says, in verse 21, we just read in English, Mizbech adama ta'aseh li, make for me. You shall make an altar of earth for me. I want you to remember that because we're going to be hearing that same expression next week in Parashat Truma, and it's going to be referring to the Mishkan, to the tabernacle. Make for me. Almost every commandment of the 613 commandments that we receive in Torah are not described as aseli. Hashem's not saying, do it for me. All the commandments are for us. All these things God doesn't need. But in certain cases, interesting, the altar, the Mizbeach, and the Mishkan, the tabernacle, Mikdash, temple, to aseli, make it for me. We're going to be talking about that next week in depth, but I just wanted to mention that right now before we go on. So then you're going to ask the question, getting back to Mishpatim. So if these Mishpatim, if these ordinances, these laws, which regulates how we behave toward one, or how we react in court before a judge when there's a problem, either a disagreement or someone has caused injury to someone, etc., etc. Why in the middle of that, between that and the Ten Commandments, after we just learned that this is a continuation, direct continuation of the Ten Commandments, isn't it odd that there's that commandment about making an altar? It seems out of place. Right? We started out the Ten Commandments. I am HaShem, who took you out of Egypt, etc., etc. And we end it with don't murder, don't steal, don't lie, don't covet. And then we learned about making an altar. And now we're back to ordinances, back to laws governing how we behave toward one another. So you might say, well, I would have thought that the commandment to make an altar would be the perfect introduction for the commandment to make a tabernacle and all the holy vessels that go in the tabernacle, which we are going to be discussing at length starting next week's parasha throughout the continuation, the conclusion of the book of Exodus. So why do we mention briefly the altar and then jump back to these ordinances, to these civil laws? And the answer to that question is very, very profound and very, very true. Before we can even consider making a place amongst us, a place within our midst for Hashem's presence to dwell, we have to know how to live with one another. We have to know how to conduct our business in a proper way. Not expecting that we're going to be perfect, because if we were perfect, we wouldn't need these laws. We wouldn't need these laws that come to tell us what to do when something has happened that shouldn't have happened. But we are expected to uphold these laws and to abide by these laws, and the judges are expected to judge properly and righteously without favoring one over another. And only then do we create the necessary groundwork to even consider creating a space within our midst, within our community, within our nation, within the brotherhood of nations, for Hashem's presence to dwell amongst us. We have to be the best we can be in order to merit Hashem being near to us. So that is the reason why we go into all of these very many laws ad nauseum, you could say, because it really gets very involved. And it's pretty much the A to Z here of the civil law of the Torah. There'll be references back to it many times in coming chapters and in the coming books of the 5 books of Moses. And there will be other details and other things added. But this is by and large the legal body of civil law, which is contained in the Torah. So up in front here, first things first, before we get into the idea of a tabernacle, the idea of a dwelling place for Hashem, and all the details that entails, we have to get this down and understand that this is of the utmost importance. There's really nothing more important than this Because if you say, well, making a house for Hashem and bringing offerings, that's all more important because that's what Hashem wants. Yes, but it can only happen when we are conducting ourselves properly vis-a-vis one another. And of course, this is why so many places we read from the prophets, from Jeremiah, from Isaiah and others, that, I don't want your stinking offerings. I want you to act justly. I want you to treat each other properly. Now, our prophets are not saying, no, Hashem doesn't want offerings. Hashem doesn't, need offerings anymore. Some people say, we don't need offerings. We don't need a holy temple because the prophet said, I don't want your, it's literally, I don't want your stinking offerings. But the prophets make it very clear that Hashem doesn't want Israel's offerings if we are not conducting ourselves righteously, if we are acting corruptly, if we are acting violently toward one another, with hatred toward one another, then those offerings are worthless. In fact, to Hashem, they're vulgar, because it's a sort of like a type of a cover-up. Oh, I'll do what I want to do, and I will act evilly, but I'll make an offering, and that will cover up my sins. No, it doesn't work that way. That's what the prophets are saying. Act righteously, and then Hashem can accept your offerings. So this portion of Mishpatim is not, for those who like a storyline and who like so far the book of Exodus has been stories. It's been a history, but they're taught, history's being related as, this event, that event, and it's very exciting. It's been very exciting. Every Torah reading each week seems to top the one before in terms of excitement and adventure and action. And all of a sudden, this one, we come to a halt, and we get into very deep and technical stuff, which is not the same experience as we read it. It's sort of, whoa, what's going on here? This is, just reading some lines here. If a fire shall go forth and find thorns in a stack of grain or a standing crop, or a field is consumed, the one who kindled the fire shall make restitution. Okay, that's all well and good. And of course, it's extremely important, but in terms of, reading material, it's technical. It's not an adventure. It's not exciting like we have been reading up till now. So, but we have to make this stop. We have to make this pause, and we have to understand how important these laws are, that we learn and know how to conduct ourselves, because that's first things first. Don't even think about creating a place, a space for Hashem until you've got your act together, as in being a just and compassionate and peaceful society. And of course, this is why, remember at the beginning of last week's parsha, beginning of Yitro, when Yitro, Moshe's father-in-law, arrives and he sees Moshe standing before the entire assembly of Israel, which is hundreds of thousands of people, and they're all coming to him with their difficulties, with their problems, with their disagreements, with their questions. What do we do in this case? How do we remedy this situation? And he is treating every case one after the other. And Yitro says, it can't go on this way. You're going to wear yourself out. And you're going to wear them out. This is bureaucracy at its worst, because it's a bureaucracy of just one bureaucrat. Not that Moshe was a bureaucrat, of course, but it just takes too long and it's too exhausting. So, as we recall, Yitro advised Moshe as how to create a judicial system with different levels of courts, and each court being capable of each higher level being capable of listening to and rendering a higher level judgment, a more difficult judgment, until ultimately the ultimate judge in the system is Moshe himself. And of course, this is a creation of the Sanhedrin, the 70 elders, who it would be that Moshe would sit with the 70 elders. That's the top level of the judicial system. So again, even before we read about Mount Sinai, we read about the Ten Commandments, even before that, the issue of a proper judiciary, how to listen to and how to, what's the word, educate, I'm not sure, how to render judgment is already top priority. So that's how important to the Torah and to HaShem, our ability to live proper lives with one another as individuals, as neighbors, and as communities, and of course as nations, and ultimately, God willing, as a family of nations. Wouldn't it be nice if as a family of nations, we could all, basically honor the same very basic rules and regulations that the Torah sets out, and thereby be able to live as nations with one another without war, without strife, etc., etc. So then our next question may be, okay, I got it. I understand why Mishpatim. I understand why we're going to read these ordinances, this civil law right now. It is very important. We need to learn how to live with one another. And then that second verse that I didn't read before, in Parashat Mishpatim, after, and these are the ordinances that you shall place before them, goes like this. Chapter 21, verse 2. If you buy a Jewish bondsman, he shall work for 6 years, and in the seventh he shall go free for no charge. If he shall arrive by himself, he shall leave by himself. If he is the husband of a woman, his wife shall leave with him. If his master will give him a woman, and she bears his sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall belong to her master, and he shall go out by himself. But if the bondsman shall say, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I shall not go free, then his master shall bring him to the court, and shall bring him to the door or to the doorpost, and his master shall bore through his ear with the awl, and he shall serve him forever. And it goes on with more laws concerning avadim, bondsmen and women. And so, again, the first question we have is, whoa, we just left Egypt. We just escaped from slavery. And so why are we talking about slavery here? Isn't that a bad thing? And why is it the very first thing that comes up here in this discussion of civil law? So that second question I'll answer first. Why? Because are you free people or are you slaves? That is always a decision. That's always a conscious decision. Whether or not we're literally enslaved or just are slaves to whatever it is that is controlling our lives, it's always a question, are we slaves or are we free people? And that is the meaning behind the concept that a man who says, I don't want to go free, I don't want to leave my master. That's why he is taken to a doorpost and his ear is pierced against the doorpost. Why a doorpost? To remind us that how did we become free ultimately in Egypt? How did we get out of Egypt? What was the sign? What was our part in the deal that made all the difference? When we slaughtered the lamb and painted the doorposts with the blood of the lamb, and God saw that as a sign, and those people, over those households, he skipped over, did not kill the firstborn, and those households left Egypt that night. So this is pointing out you either choose your freedom by painting that blood in a doorpost, or you choose your lack of freedom by putting your ear to the doorpost and having it pierced. So that would seem to be the reason why it's the very first thing to be discussed right here in Parashat Mishpatim. Let's get that clear. Let's make that very clear that you want to be free, it's a conscious decision. Even though HaShem freed you, even though you are creating a society of free people now, it's always a conscious decision and a conscious act of each of us. And in fact, we have challenges each day, and we either rise up to those challenges or we don't. And failing to rise up to challenges can with not wanting to use this word, without proper respect for what it means, we can become slaves to so many things. We can become slaves to our own procrastination if we don't take care of things, and then we have the burden. It's a conscious act of freedom, to choose freedom. It's something we need to do each day. It's not, as we say in Hebrew, muvan me'alav. It's not, we can't just assume that we're free people. We have to behave as free people and always be acting on behalf of our freedom. So then the question comes, okay, got it. We need to be free. But what is this issue of slavery that the Torah seems to be acknowledging here? Why should this be part of the Israelite society? So let's get an understanding here. What is translated as slavery, or translated in this, what I'm reading from, as bondsmen, which is a better translation, because what they're talking about are Hebrew slaves, meaning Hebrew bondsmen, meaning Hebrews who basically it's indentured servitude. It's an indentured servant, meaning they basically make a contract with someone that they will work without pay for a certain amount of time, either in order to pay off a debt, or in certain cases, if they stole something and could not redeem the value of it, they have to pay off that theft. And so they become indentured servants for a limited time, right? Because we know after 6 years, the 7th year, they're allowed to go free. And that whole question of whether a man, a Hebrew bondsman, wanted to go free and could decide whether he wants to go free or he loves his master, is a question that occurs in that 7th year. He has the option to leave. And when he leaves, he leaves with pay. He leaves with property. It's very clear in the Torah how these indentured servants are to be treated, and they are to be treated by their masters as equals, actually. And the master, if the master, I don't know if that's even a proper word, because it's not chattel slavery here. It's not somebody owning somebody. Again, it's indentured servitude, somebody who is working, as it were, for free because they're paying off a debt. But it's very clear that the bondsman or women have to be provided with proper food, proper meal, the same food that the master eats, and clothing, and they cannot be asked to do a task that is beneath them. You can't, someone who is a blacksmith, you can't say, okay, I want you to scrub the floor. That's not what it's about. This is a professional person who is in your hire for 6 years. Now, of course, on the Jubilee year, everybody goes free. Everybody goes free. And again, there are certain rules and regulations concerning bondsmen and certain concerning bondswomen. And they're not exactly the same. And why is that? All I can say about that is, in those times, in the natural course of the nations, women had little, if any, rights. But the indentured bondswomen do have rights. And they also can, when they leave, they need to be provided for. And they certainly cannot be treated as property. And even a non-Hebrew bondsperson, a Canaanite bondsperson who doesn't have the same rights as the Hebrew bondsperson. They don't have the option after 6 years of leaving, but they can leave and they can have their freedom purchased. And when they leave, they also have to be provided for, and they cannot be sold, as it were, to a non-Jew, or in this period of time, a non-Israelite, because that non-Israelite might bring them back to idolatry. And also they can opt to join the Jewish nation and to convert, at which point then they become equal and they're freed from their bondage. So there's much more to it than that. But another very, very, very important factor is that Shabbat is for everybody. Your servants, whether they be Jewish or not Jewish, they are not to work on Shabbat. They are to enjoy the Shabbat just as everyone else does. And so basically, these people are equal to their, quote, owners in every way, except they've entered into a contractual agreement. And that is the type of, I'm putting in quotation marks, slavery, or I should say indentured servitude, that the Torah describes here, that the Torah allows for. Now, historically, this practice did not continue for that long through the centuries. It ended, by and large, relatively early in the history of Israel. But that's what it was all about. Now, I want to skip over to the very end of Parashat Mishpatim, where we return to our scene. We return to Mount Sinai. And after this long list of Mishpatim, of ordinances, which conclude actually with a description of the pilgrimage festivals, Passover, Sukkot, and Shavuot. And then in chapter 23, verse 20, HaShem says, "Behold, I send an angel before you to protect you on the way and to bring you to the place that I have made ready." And we go back to the desert, back to the wilderness, and then we get into this wonderfully beautiful mystical experience, which I'm not going to really have time to describe now, of course, where Moshe, Aaron, Nadav, and Avihu, and 7 of the elders of Israel assembled at the bottom of the mountain, and they saw a vision of HaShem, the God of Israel, and under his feet was a likeness of sapphire brickwork, and it was like the essence of the heaven in purity against the great men of the children of Israel. He did not stretch out his hand. They gazed at HaShem, they ate and they drank. So we have this wonderful mystical vision, great vision of clarity of Hashem's presence, and the response is to eat and to drink, to celebrate, to bring it into our lives, into our experience. Again, I'd like to talk about this more at length next week, but we're running out of time here. Just a few seconds left. But it's so important that that the Torah brings us right back to where we were before, and now Moshe is at the end, the conclusion, after this visionary experience. He goes up to Mount Sinai, where he's going to be in isolation with Hashem for 40 days and 40 nights. It's described that Moshe arrived in the midst of the cloud and ascended the mountain, and Moshe was on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. Basically, he went into the cloud. He disappeared from the sight of Israel for 40 days and 40 nights. And when we pick up our story next week, we're going to hear, like a fly on the wall, as it were, not that there's a fly on the wall way up there at Mount Sinai, what God said to Moshe during those 40 days and 40 nights. And thank you so much for being with me today on Temple Talk.